Kids walk, Hillary squawks, and Elizabeth Warren insists on the fake mohawk. All of this and an interview with Ronald Reagan's personal assistant, Peggy Grande, next on The Dr. Duke Show. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Duke, and thank you for joining us today on The Dr. Duke Show. As always, I'm joined by Katie Petrick of The Healthy Republic for the Countdown. Katie, what do you got for us today?
Well, we have a number of stories to get to, but before we do, we must address what's happening in the nation. The national story is the walkout, with all of the high school students walking out of their high schools. And it was supposed to be at 10 a.m. for 17 minutes to represent the 17 souls that were lost at the shooting in Parkland, and they were demanding that the schools get stricter gun laws. And so I had the unfortunate task of watching the live coverage, and it was a spectacle to say the least. Now, in D.C., there was a lot going on. The crowd actually began by having their backs turned to the Capitol for 17 minutes, and I think that says a lot about how they were addressing Congress and how these students view the process for changing legislation. Basically, the premise is that these, the Congress members were not doing their job, and so these kids decided to go to Congress, and Congress actually walked out of session for them. And I guess we have a picture I wanted to show of just some of the things that are happening. It was a lot of stuff that started with Chuck Schumer saying, tweeting out, heading out now, and it just became a spectacle because everyone in Congress was taking pictures, and the kids were taking pictures back to them. So it just became a whole lot of chaos.
Yeah, let me start by adjusting a couple of things you said. Number one, souls aren't lost, they're just reassigned. We know that, right? Number two, these weren't just high school kids. It'd be one thing if this was just high school kids walking out, but these were elementary and even middle and elementary school kids in some cases were walking out as well. So kids at very young ages without the slightest grasp of what's going on here or what is at stake here or what the Second Amendment says, these kids now have been co-opted into this movement as well. And that's part of what I think the problem I have with this is. This is what I call mob virtue signaling. Up until recently, virtue signaling used to be an independent thing, right? That I'm going to show you how liberal I am. I'm going to show you how politically correct I am. I'm going to display my social justice credentials here in front of this microphone. Now, the American left has decided not just to turn virtue signaling into a mob enterprise, but mobs of little kids. And one of the main problems I have here is, A, these are government-funded schools, right? These are public schools, which means they belong to the taxpayers. So we're paying for kids to walk out of those schools. And the administration, the other thing that bothers me about this is the administration is urging kids to leave the schools in many instances. You have teachers' unions that support the walkout. You've had other kinds of unions that say they'll defend legally any kid who gets punished for walking out. First of all, I wish these kids would walk out for the educational malfeasance they're receiving. Let's have kids walking out because they can't read. Let's have kids walking out because they can't write, they can't get into college, that 42% of kids in Maryland aren't going to graduate because only 42% will graduate because they don't have the skills to do it. Let's start protesting that. If we're going to turn everything into a school-based protest, let's protest things way beyond guns, number one. Number two, this idea that mob virtue signaling, which I think is what is going on here. This mob virtue signaling is exactly what you said it is. We're not talking about the dead kids. We're not talking about what we can do to honor them, memorialize them, remember them, and move forward. We're just using this as an assault on things that are very far away from the actual shooting. The NRA is housed 1,000 miles away from Parkland. Congress, right, is 1,000 miles away. So you've got local community problems. You've got an FBI who was warned twice and didn't do anything. You've got a kid who was visited by the local police in Parkland 39 times and they did nothing. David Hogg has nothing to say about them. You'd have a much better job of making sure that kids are protected if the local mental health authorities, the local schools, and the local FBI and police followed up, paid attention when there were credible warnings, act on them. There's not a single gun law on the books that could have prevented this. In other words, the gun laws that we had should have been sufficient. The mental health aspect of this fell apart. The family aspect fell apart, family monitoring, and all those authorities had been warned, they fell apart. Before we start changing things on a global level, before we start demanding a shredding of the Constitution to make these kids happy, let's start on the local level. Politics is always best on the local level, and change always comes best on the local level and let the change build up from Parkland, reform the mental health areas down there, take to task, get rid of those FBI agents who ignored the problem, those cops who visited 39 times, find a way to reform, and the cops who wouldn't run into the building, find a way to reform that before you start tearing apart the Constitution. But the fact that all of this is directed at Washington, D.C., all of this is directed at the NRA, tells you that these are a lot of young kids being manipulated to hate certain groups. The entire premise of the NRA is gun safety and wise gun use, protecting gun owners. That seems to be a very far cry from what these people are accusing them of.
Yeah, and what you saw at these rallies and these walkouts was exactly that, is a bunch of students who don't really know what's happening yelling about the NRA. They yelled their chants. That was going in D.C. right as you saw members of Congress walking out onto the steps to come join the students. And then they topped it by saying, hey, NRA, how many kids have you killed today?
That's exactly right. And who sponsors this? You know, if this was, first of all, can you imagine, would the public schools allow this many kids to walk out in favor of pro-life issues? Would there be the support? Would there be the rallies going on? What would the feminists be saying? The feminist groups, like the group that organized the ridiculous march, the Women's March against Trump back when he was inaugurated, they're behind this. They're spending a lot of money on this.
Yeah, well, and one of their big sponsors is Planned Parenthood.
Planned Parenthood. Right. So if this number of kids walked out for 60 minutes to honor 60 murdered, aborted babies, we would have nothing like this kind of, they have absolute moral authority, we must leave them alone, we can't question their motivations, we can't argue with them. No, these kids would be accused of being propaganda shills of an out-of-control, evil anti-abortion people, right? And so why are we not allowed? And here's the thing that bothers me. So much of what these kids are saying, so much of what the spokespeople for these kids are saying is wrong. They're factually wrong. They don't know an automatic from a semi-automatic weapon. They don't know what an assault rifle is. They don't know what the NRA actually does and doesn't do. They don't know the fact that the NRA doesn't take federal funds the way Planned Parenthood does to murder our babies. So they just don't know. And isn't it ironic that the purpose of school is not to tell kids that their feelings are 100% right and virtuous. The purpose of school used to be to educate kids on issues so they could have a critically informed opinion when they graduated. It shows you what kind of malfeasance we have in the schools when they are participating in a situation where uninformed rage and grief is allowed to turn into political activism, rather than spending more time with those kids in school to give them a fully nuanced opinion so they could make wise, not emotional decisions.
Yeah, and all you saw at these walkouts, and the one in D.C. especially, was emotion.
Right.
They announced, Bernie Sanders is coming out, and the live telecast, it was just them, Bernie, and they literally ran after him.
How long has Bernie's been in office since, what, Moses was alive?
I think it was around Moses.
In fact, Bernie's one of those guys, that's Bernie Sanders, never had an actual job. This wonderful socialist fella, right, whose entire work has been government work, who's now with his wife, they've got $1 million beach condo and all that stuff. All right, so they honeymooned, I believe they honeymooned in the Soviet Union, one of the most murderous regimes of the last 100 years. There's a moral authority on guns. In fact, I would ask Bernie Sanders, all these kids love him now, right? I'd ask Bernie Sanders, you honeymooned in the Soviet Union. Who has guns in the Soviet Union? Mom and dad? Did the Ukrainians have guns? Did the Poles have guns when you rolled your tanks in? You know who had the guns? The government. It seems to me that Bernie Sanders should understand better than anybody that this is not, this issue about the Parkland killings is not about the Second Amendment. It's about how do we identify kids who are broken to the degree that they are willing to hurt others. And I'll say this too. We can do a great job, a really great job, protecting our celebrities, our politicians, protecting our sporting events, right? We have a great job at the airlines making sure, right? Yep. We ought to be able to, at a very little cost, relatively speaking, to the lives lost, we ought to be able to make sure that our schools are protected. It doesn't require, no matter what you do, you're not going to get rid of all the nuts, and you're not going to get rid of all the guns. But what you can do is make the schools safe so that you have enough of a presence there, an armed presence there, that people think twice before they go on campus to shoot. Why are lunatics going on college campuses and middle school campuses? Because they know categorically there are no guns there. It's much harder to get into an airport. It's much harder to get into a Costco, right? Given that there are security forces there. But the one place they know they're never going to find them is at the elementary school. So we've got a lot of things we can fix before we shred the Constitution.
Yeah, and if they would have used this logic and spoke up at these rallies about this, just use common sense and told these students this, maybe we'd get somewhere. But
yeah, and I really think that if there were common sense approaches coming from these kids that understood the nuance of this, I think more of us would be more than willing to give them a hearing. And I'm not blaming the kids. I want to make that clear before we move on. I'm not blaming the kids. I'm blaming these groups that are co-opting those kids. Again, if this was any conservative issue at all, whether kids were marching out for border security, they would be called racist bigots and would be expelled, right? Yep. Or they'd be punished for walking out.
Suspended for sure.
Exactly. Hell, just even having a pro-Trump's hat, a MAGA hat in one of these public schools is going to get you suspended. Yeah. But marching out, right, for a purely nakedly political cause like this, it is utterly promoted and sponsored and protected by the progressives who run the schools. And that should tell you that whatever else you want to pretend this is a highly manipulative, politicized moment. It is a political gambit first before it is anything else.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens with it. But for now, I'm moving on because I had enough of having to watch it. So
quite tired of it.
I am quite tired. So it's still March. It's Women's History Month. And Hillary Clinton is still blaming everyone but herself for her loss a year and a half ago. This weekend she was in India and she was tripping all over herself, both figuratively and literally. And I want to check out this clip.
Now that's interesting. What was your initial thought when you saw that clip?
I thought she slipped, maybe not quite as bad as she slipped in the polls when she lost the election. I don't know which one's funnier.
Yeah, the thing about it is that this is a woman who clearly has some health issues. And if she wants to travel the globe and she wants to have circumstances like that where she demonstrates that, you know, she's been diminished by age and by a lot of things, that's fine. She has every right to do that. I'm more object to the fact that she's over there selling out the rest of the country. Some of the things she said were pretty outrageous to the Indian people, that middle American women, right, women who don't live on the coasts, basically, they voted for Donald Trump because they were too afraid of their husbands not to.
If you look at the map of the United States, there's all that red in the middle where Trump won. I win the coasts, I win, you know, Illinois and Minnesota, places like that. But what the map doesn't show you is that I won the places that represent 2/3 of America's gross domestic product. So I won the places that are optimistic, diverse, dynamic, moving forward. And his whole campaign, Make America Great Again, was looking backwards. You know, you didn't like black people getting rights. You don't like women, you know, getting jobs. You don't want to, you know, see that Indian American succeeding more than you are. Whatever your problem is, I'm going to solve it.
I don't know. That comment is so outrageous. It is so discriminatory. It is so backward. It is so designed to whip up anger and resentment. The fact is that a lot of white women voted for Donald Trump, way more than she expected. If she got the women's vote she expected to get, she'd be president right now. And I will not say that these women are stupid. I will not say that, and I will not say, like she says, that you can actually pigeonhole people this way. In her world, in her elitist Harvard, Oxford, Bill Clinton, White House world, she doesn't know what working class women deal with, and she's proved it every time. When she was the first lady, she proved it, right? So her response to people that she doesn't know is the typical progressive response, right? There's flyover country, right, which we really are embarrassed about. We'd like to give it back to the Native Americans if we could. We'd strip all the people off the land and force them to live in big cities on the coast if we could do that. These are the people that have the deplorables, right? She called them deplorables. Barack Obama called them bitter clingers with their guns, right? And I think the fact that she's over there in India, sliding down the temple wall, is a wonderful image for her career. Propped up by what, right? And I love the fact in that video that Huma Abedin is there. And she's walking right behind Hillary step by step. And as Hillary is doing she's tobogganing without a toboggan down those stairs, she's just on her cell phone,
typical
right?
Millennial look.
Probably sexting Anthony Weiner in prison or something. But that's what this has come to. It was a very lonely picture of the lioness in winter. It's kind of hyperbolical and stupid and embarrassing.
Yeah. And you're a white male, so I can't let you put words in her mouth, so I want to listen to what she said specifically about white men and white women who are married.
Okay.
We do not do well with white men and we don't do well with married white women. And part of that is an identification with the Republican Party and a sort of ongoing pressure to vote the way that your husband, your boss, your son, whoever, believes you should.
So she's saying that white men, that we don't do well with white men, and we don't do well with the married white women, and it's, you know, it's all the Republican Party's fault, because us white women are going to be pressured by how our husbands vote, how our bosses vote, how your sons may vote. And so clearly me, white woman, I can't decide for myself who I'm voting for. So
Now, Hillary Clinton's a white woman.
I believe so.
Married to a white man.
Well, still, I guess.
Who's also kind of a serial abuser.
A little bit.
Right? And somebody who is a harasser of women.
Yep.
Accused of rape.
Pretty sure.
Accused of punching women.
A little bit.
This is the same Hillary Clinton that said, if I'm not mistaken, she would never be like Tammy Wynette and stand by her man.
Oh, standing by your man.
Did she stand by her man?
Well,
she kind of did, didn't she?
She kind of did.
Wasn't she in charge of the bimbo eruption squad? Right, as they called it, James Carville. You can't drag a $5 bill through a trailer park, and these women will come after you. This is the kind of woman. This is what she's protected all her life, right? And the idea that somehow she has moral authority on this issue, because she is, for the sake of her political career and her husband's political career, she aided and abetted at every step the misbehavior of her husband. She is a serial co-conspirator with her husband. Now she's going to turn around and slur women whose husbands happen to be conservatives, right? Look, I'm married. You're married, right? I'm pretty sure my wife doesn't do a darn thing I tell her. Do you do everything your husband tells you?
He listens to what I say.
He listens to what you say. Yeah, that's the men and women that are still married. That's how it always goes,
that's
right?
How it works.
So the fact that she is so divorced from reality is why she lost. And what does this mean? Throw this out there for you. How utterly divorced from reality and real life does Hillary Clinton have to be to make Donald Trump look like an every-handed Joe the Plumber type guy?
Yep.
Right? How completely out of touch does Hillary have to be for Donald Trump, in the comparison, to be the everyman? But that's exactly what she was. So extreme and stupid that Donald Trump, Silver Spoon Donnie, right, who I voted for, don't get me wrong, decent guy, happy he's president, rather have him president than her. But the idea that she made Donald Trump look like a 9-to-5 working guy for most Americans tells you everything you need to know about Hillary Clinton.
That's basically true. And before we move on, I'd like to go back to the look of Hillary Clinton. So I have a question for you. Who wore it better? Do we have Hillary Clinton in India, or do we have Puff the Marshmallow Man?
Puff, the Stay Puffed Marshmallow guy. I think there's a lot of similarities there. And if you go back to that clip, and you can go back and rewind the show yourself and look at it, as she's kind of oozing unctuously down the Indian temple steps, she kind of looks a lot like the Stay Puffed Marshmallow Man, right? And so there is a sense that, and we all know it, the one thing they both have in common that's undeniably true is on foreign policy, they're both squishy soft.
All right. Well, we're going to move on, because we're going to go from India to Indian, with Elizabeth Warren is back in the news for her needing of mini-me attention compared to Hillary Clinton. And she's on her crusade still to claim her Native American status. She went on the weekend shows, and she was touting her heritage. And someone actually called her out and said, hey, prove it once and for all that you are Native American. All you have to do is spit into a cup, and we'll determine your ancestry. And guess what she said? No.
Yeah, well, this is really unfortunate, and we've got a great graphic up there now. Senator Elizabeth Warren, and better known as, it's impossible. She has a chance to take a simple test that will prove once and for all and justify her. If she absolutely is Native American heritage, then I'll be the first to apologize. If you throw that graphic back up for a second, I think we've reached the point now where she will not let us prove it, which tells us that she's not. And so some of the names that have been used in her direction, Pocahontas, I think that's right. She is a fake Indian. Paints with colors of the windbag, that's exactly right. She is a chief appropriator, right? She is a cultural appropriator of Native American heritage. She got hired at Harvard making $350,000 a year on the simple premise that she was taking a Native American scholarship, right? A Native American position. So she was hired under false pretenses, freezing out a qualified Native American candidate. This is the problem that you have here. These people she won't apologize for it. She is Hillary Clinton One of them's in India playing the fool. One's pretending to be an Indian and playing the fool.
Yeah, and as recently as on this weekend's show, she actually said, "I know who I am," and never used it for anything. Never got any benefit from it anywhere. Really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, facts don't really matter to Democrats, do they? Facts and reality and the idea that, people can actually pay attention to these sort of things, that the Cherokee keep very detailed rolls about who is and who is not Cherokee. And the thing that blows me away about it is you have a simple little swab the inside of the cheek test that could prove us all wrong, and she won't take it. She has no principle to stand on.
None. So we're going to end on a doozy here. Jill Abramson. So Jill Abramson used to be the editor of the New York Times, and she has been writing for The Guardian. And this weekend, she decided to talk about how to, recover here and stay sane whilst this Donald Trump presidency. She carries an Obama doll in her purse. She finds it as a comfort.
So you've got insecure progressive women, rich progressive women, privileged rich progressive women who are so a Twitter over Donald Trump as president that she carries a little Donald Trump fetish with her.
Barack Obama.
A little Barack Obama statue, right? She carries in her purse. Well, I love the totemic nation idea of this, that some people carry their St. Christopher medals, others have a crucifix. She's got a little plastic Obama in her purse. And the real question I got to ask myself for these really insecure liberal women, what kind of batteries does it take?
I don't know if it's going to be AA, AAA.
I mean, there is this creepy, romantic associate. The messiah of the American left, Barack Obama, was also a highly sexualized figure to some of these crazy liberal women. Remember how they used to pass out during Obama's speeches when he was on the campaign tour? Like he was Bobby Soxers, right? So you've got Jill Abramson, who really needs to have this little toy in her purse that she can manipulate for her comfort when she thinks about Donald Trump too much. There's a really bad Saturday Night Live skit there that, alas, we know they're never going to do.
Yep, it's just another day in Crazy Town.
That's right. I'm very excited to welcome Peggy Grande to the program. Mrs. Grande served as President Reagan's executive assistant from 1989 to 1999, where she took care of all of his post-presidential needs and was witness to some incredible private meetings with figures as diverse as Mikhail Gorbachev, Margaret Thatcher, and Mother Teresa. She has penned a wonderful book entitled The President Will See You Now, My Stories and Lessons from Ronald Reagan's Final Years. Peggy, it is a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for having me on your program.
Thank you. And, well, the first question I want to ask you is, every aspect of Ronald Reagan's life is pretty mythical, right? He was a Hollywood movie star before he became the cowboy in the white hat, before he became the Cold War hero president, and before he became, in Rush Limbaugh's words, Ronaldus Magnus, Ronaldus the Great.
Yes, I love that.
And wonderful. Yeah, and I think every one of those are well-deserved. Talk a little bit in your experience. You basically worked with him after he was president and as he was in decline health-wise. Talk about how and in what ways Ronald Reagan defies all of those mythic titles and was really a man of the people and a common guy and an all-around decent fellow. Talk about the personal Ronald Reagan behind all those labels.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share my stories about President Reagan. I did have the opportunity of a lifetime to serve this man for 10 years from 1989, right after he left office, until 1999, when he left the public eye. And what an incredible opportunity to see this man, not as a politician and not as the president, but just as a man. And it's my boss and the former leader of the free world. I mean, what an amazing front row seat to history. And I would say that he's one of those few people that, regardless of the pedestal you had put him on, when you met him in person, he was surprisingly maybe even better than you had imagined. He was sort of this mythical creature, but when you met him in person, there was this twinkle in his eye, this way he would connect with you directly, and he made you feel like you were the most important person in the room, whether you were a head of state or you were just an everyday, ordinary, patriotic American who had great respect for him.
Well, that's neat. And so when you're dealing with him as an individual, the more you got to know him, was he more approachable the more you worked with him? Or did he? A lot of famous people tend to have even close friends at arm's length. He sounds like he was very approachable and very personable in his ways of interacting with private people.
He absolutely was. And I got to see that for myself, of course, working with him closely. I got to watch his interaction with my own children, which I write about in my book, and how fun that was to see him sort of as a grandfather figure to my own kids, and to just watch how he wasn't bound by title. He didn't care whether you were president of a country or just the president of a company. He treated everybody with equal respect, and he was very warm and approachable. We know about his great sense of humor, and he really used that to put people at ease, to make them feel comfortable, to get them laughing and get them talking when they came in to visit him. Because you could imagine people were pretty nervous to meet him for the first time.
What always amazes me about Ronald Reagan, I mentioned that list, right? Hollywood movie star, cowboy, politician, president. It seemed to me that he was absolutely all of those things at the same time. You who got to know him really well, would you say he was more cowboy than he was president, or more actor than he was world figure? Where would you say the dominance in his personality was?
Well, he would have said that he was all of those, definitely, and people who belittled and mocked him for just being a cowboy actor playing the role of president, he would spin it right back on them and say, well, I don't know how you could be president without being an actor. So he brought everything that he was to everything that he did, and what a truly great American story. Only in America can a story like his be told. I mean, we think of him as president of the United States, but what most people don't realize is he grew up in a wide spot in the middle of central Illinois. He was very poor. He was born in the midst of the Great Depression. His father was an alcoholic. And if you look at the cards of life he had been given, we would have thought, oh, this poor kid will never amount to anything. But life has a wonderful way of working out. He was raised by a woman of faith and a great optimism who raised him to believe that anything was possible, and how grateful we are for his mother to raise him to believe that anything was possible. And he certainly proves that anything is.
It's lovely hearing stories about Reagan. There's so much longing for the days of Ronald Reagan. Let me ask before we move on to another area of question. Is there any one thing you would add to those epithets? We've got, again, cowboy, we've got president, we've got all those things. Is there, if you had to say one other thing that people don't know that Ronald Reagan may have been mythically, what would it be?
Well, I would say the thing that people underestimated about him was how disciplined and scholarly he was. And he sort of played that to his advantage. He didn't mind people thinking that he was the amiable dunce or whatever they wanted to deride him as. But behind the scenes, I saw him to be a man who was thoughtful. He read a lot. He was very disciplined. He wrote and edited so many of his own speeches. He was very involved in the crafting of messaging. And so I guess I was surprised by that when I first started working for him. But over the years, just watching the disciplined way in which he approached everything, he was always prepared. And so his preparation allowed him to appear like it was just effortless when he would show up to an event or speak at a program. But behind that was a lot of discipline and hard work.
Well, you anticipated my next question. Just like conservatives, people of goodwill, people who just loved Ronald Reagan, we see him in all these mythic terms. But the angry left, which has gotten just angrier, haven't they, since the Reagan administration, they called him, like you said, amiable dunce. They called him a senile puppet. They called him a doddering fool. And most hatefully and absolutely out of bounds, they actually called him an enabler of AIDS, right? We remember that horrible slur against him. And so I wanted to ask you, in line with that, you just answered it in part. Talk a little bit about his intellect, though. You mentioned his work habits. It always seems like he turned the tables on the people who doubted them, and those who underestimated or sought to pigeonhole him. He was so clever and so good with words that he was able to maneuver these people into a position of advantage. Can you talk a little bit about the intellectual achievements of the man that really give the lie to all those terrible slurs?
Yeah, he was very well read. He kept, I mean, this was the day before you could Google a quote or something. He kept these little card file books of quotes and speech notes and things that were important to him that he had read over the years. And he used them as his own little reference books. And so when he was creating a speech, he would go to these books and flip through and look for the perfect quote. He was always enhancing and improving anything that was written and submitted to him for review. And so he was very thoughtful and substantive. And he also was a great studier of the left, I guess you could say, because he believed that you couldn't articulate your point of view unless you knew what the other side was using to articulate their point of view. And so I think people really underestimated the fact that not only was he crafting a message for himself, but he really was studying the other side of the aisle as well, so that he knew how to give those perfect sound bites back at them and sometimes use their own words against them.
President Reagan always seemed so preternaturally happy. Like even in the midst of crisis, even in the midst of disaster, there was a ringing optimism to him that just inspired a nation. Can you say, in the post-presidency years, was there any bitterness or residual regret for things he didn't do or for the way people had treated him? From the outside, it looks like he didn't have a resentful or bitter bone in his body. What did you find?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. This was not a man of vengeance or bitterness, or really even somebody to look backwards. He was always a man looking forward, looking to the future, investing in young people, and believing that America's best days were yet ahead. Now, he did have a couple of things that he felt like were maybe unfinished business, and he was very careful not to step on the toes of his former vice president, who was then the president of the United States, President Bush, but did speak out about a couple of things that he wished he had gotten accomplished, like giving the president the opportunity to have the line item veto. At the time, there were 20-something governors who had that privilege, and the president of the United States did not, and he thought that that would go a long way toward balancing the budget. He also spoke out against the 22nd Amendment. I don't think he wanted to run for a third term, but he grew up under FDR and believed that the will of the people should be followed and that we should allow people to vote for the person they want as many times as they wanted. And he also spoke out against the whole process of gerrymandering and how it truly was against the will of people to live and vote in voting blocks. And he thought that that was very anti-American. And so he continued to be engaged in the dialogue of the day, but always being very mindful not to backseat drive the presidency, because he knew that unless you were in that Oval Office, you really didn't have all the information that the occupant of the Oval Office had.
Again, those of us who remember him so well miss him dearly, and we remember those little personal touches. You know, the jelly bellies, the jelly beans in the Oval Office, the vacations horseback riding. Can you tell us any more of those personal touches, things that he liked to have around him, or things that he really made his day, little touches that maybe the average American wouldn't know about?
Yeah, well, of course, in my book, there was so many opportunities to share stories about everything from my kids being invited to go to the zoo with the president or swim in his pool or celebrate birthdays or Christmas or Halloween with him, which as a mom is so special to be able to share your workplace and your boss, especially a boss like that, with my family. But little things in the office, there's an entire chapter about going to the rooftop of the building. And here was a man who loved Los Angeles, and as much as he liked his time in Washington, D.C., he loved returning to Los Angeles. And I write about a day that it was especially clear, and he was looking out his window, and he had this beautiful view out to the ocean, out towards Santa Monica and the Bay of Marina del Rey. And he asked if he could go to the roof and take his binoculars and look around. And so I detail how difficult it was to get this man from the 34th floor to the 35th floor so that he could take his binoculars on a beautiful, clear day and look around Los Angeles. But how he loved this city and how fun it was to see this city through his eyes, a man who had been here and loved this place for so many decades. So lots of very special moments like that would not necessarily very much seem presidential, but were very much a part of who he was and what he loved.
It's an amazing part of his legend that California was his primary, really his only opposition. As much as he loved California and never lost faith in California, the politics in California are pretty hard on moderate conservatives, let alone somebody like the Gipper. So the fact that he kept such a wonderful attitude about that place says a lot about him. And how about, I want to also clarify another misconception. The other person who gets a hugely bad rap is, of course, his wife, Nancy. She is seen in many ways as the evil foil to his foolish old man routine, right? And both are unjust. Talk a little bit about Nancy Reagan in your long tenure of taking care of the president. How were your interactions with her? How were her interactions with her husband in the last days?
Yeah, I loved interacting with Mrs. Reagan. I mean, what a strong woman, what a graceful woman. I loved watching her host people, especially in their home, and what a gracious hostess she was. You could just picture her as just a remarkable first lady and how well she represented our country. I loved watching her and the president interact, and they just had this great relationship. You know, they talk about that doughy-eyed gaze that she would give him when he was at the podium speaking, but that's actually how she looked at him all the time. But his look toward her was equally loving and sweet. And I just used to love to watch the two of them interact. You know, they could be in a room and maybe be on opposite sides of the room, and it was almost like two magnets that eventually had to find their way back together. They couldn't stand to be apart, and they were never just standing next to each other. He would always have his arm around her, or his hand in the small of her back, or be holding her hand. And what a sweet relationship they had, and how fun to watch that up close and personal. As for my relationship with Mrs. Reagan, I started out very young, very green, had a lot to learn, and she was so gracious in teaching me so many things and very patient with me. I learned early on there were a couple of things that she valued. Loyalty was important to her, as was the truth. And so I figured out very early on, if I always told her the truth in totality and didn't sugarcoat it, and sometimes you couldn't even fix it or solve it, but just told her the truth. And also, if she knew that I was completely loyal to her and to her husband, and that was really the most of what she cared about. And I honestly believe he wouldn't have become who he was without her. She was sometimes willing to be the bad guy so that her husband could be the good guy. And what a great defender of his legacy all the way to the end of her life she was.
Well, in these really chaotic political times, it is inevitable that there's not just a tremendous amount of nostalgia for Reagan the man, but also for Reagan the politician. And the election of Donald Trump in some ways paralleled the election of Ronald Reagan. Two radically liberal, arguably the two most progressive presidents we've ever had, Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, and working through their terms and pushing everything really far left politically. And along comes a Reagan, along comes a Donald Trump, kind of shake things up a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the parallels between the two men, and what might Ronald Reagan think about Donald Trump's election and his presidency so far?
Yeah. Well, I think we look back, with rose-colored glasses at Ronald Reagan's presidency, and a lot of people forget that in 1976, he was not our chosen candidate. And even in 1980, the party was very split. The party loyalists wanted George Bush, and they didn't want Ronald Reagan. And I think now we look back and pat ourselves on the back and say how brilliant we were to choose Ronald Reagan and to reelect him in a landslide. But it wasn't always Team Reagan here in our nation. And so I think that definitely has parallels to President Trump. I would say if I were to compare the two men, the thing that stands out the most is the true desire to connect directly to the American people. Ronald Reagan didn't have social media, even though I believe he would have been on social media. For a couple of reasons. He always wanted to connect with young people. He wanted to be where young people were. He believed that America's future obviously was in young people, and really wanted to connect and invest in them. But Ronald Reagan used weekly radio addresses. He also used the power of the network cameras coming into the Oval Office, and he would look down the lens and come into your living room on one of those three networks on your dial TV and say what he wanted to say. It was very important to him to talk to people directly with the words he wanted to use and say it in the way he wanted to say. And so in that sense, I believe that he and Donald Trump both are really trying to connect directly to people, connect with them where they are, and say what they want to say in the way they want to say it. And I honestly think Ronald Reagan would have been on Twitter, and he was so witty and full of one-liners. I would have loved to have followed his Twitter feed.
And I agree with you. I think the hidden secret of politics is far too many celebrity-type politicians don't realize that what the American people really want is to be talked to honestly. They want somebody who's going to talk to them, look them in the eye, and mean what they say. It's shocking how few politicians have that today. Before we go, give us the title of your book again and talk a little bit about it and where people can find it and what they're going to find when they read it.
Yeah, so it's called The President Will See You Now, My Stories and Lessons from Ronald Reagan's Final Years. It came out last year in hardback. It just recently came out in paperback. It's also available on audiobook, which I read for myself, and ebook. And really, it's the story of an ordinary woman, myself, who had the opportunity to intersect the life of an extraordinary man. And what did I learn and see and witness? And how did it change my life? And how does he still have the power to change lives today? It starts out where I'm young and green and stepping into a space that was far too big for myself. And how did I find my footing? And I think everybody can relate to that at the beginning of their career. And then you go through life and you find a way to find your footing, feel like you're a contributor and are adding value to a space that previously felt foreign. And then life has a way of throwing us curveballs. And in this case, it was Ronald Reagan's diagnosis with Alzheimer's. And how did he handle that? And how did I handle that? And how did we get through some very difficult years together? It's a very personal story. My goal as the author was to take you along with me, to walk into his office and for you to be able to see him as I saw him, to look around in the office and witness the surroundings, to witness those iconic meetings between Ronald Reagan and people like Margaret Thatcher and Gorbachev and even Mother Teresa. But then also these very special, very personal moments with people who I may not know their name. I may not even remember exactly the date they came in, but their appointment with Ronald Reagan forever changed my life. Whether it was a little boy with autism who had remembered everything about Ronald Reagan's life and came into the president's office kind of quizzing him about his own life, and to watch that sweet interaction, to military heroes who came in, and one in particular said, "I know you're no longer the commander-in-chief, but I really feel like I'd like to salute you." And President Reagan said, "I'm no longer the commander-in-chief, but I really would like to salute you back." And beautiful moments like that. And one in particular that stood out above all else was a very elderly, slumped-over Romanian woman walked into President Reagan's office one day. And she took one look at him and she fell to his feet. And she started kissing his feet and sobbing. And he reached down and he brought her to stand. And as he did, she thanked him in her very broken English for freeing her and for freeing her people from oppression. And time after time, day after day, I got to watch Ronald Reagan, his impact on people across the nation and around the world, and how these people connected the dots of their success or their advancement or their freedom back to this man.
Peggy Grande, many thanks for joining us today and sharing your really unique, special, wonderful perspective on the late, great President Reagan. Thank you.
In this corner, your pugilistic pundit, the Duke of Diplomacy, the Professor of Patriotism, the Doctor of Domestic Tranquility.
This is Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke.
In 2017, the geniuses of California passed a new law that bans any state-funded travel to states like Kansas or North Carolina or Mississippi or Tennessee, any state in the union that, according to California, discriminates against gay and transgender people. What's really remarkable about this is that it means sports teams. Sports teams cannot participate in tournaments. San Diego State University has a chance to play basketball, March Madness basketball, in Wichita, Kansas. And so now we have a crisis. Because of this goofy rule, this law from California, these kids are not going to be allowed to send with taxpayer money to Kansas to play basketball. And here's the thing. The whole great sin of Kansas that causes California to ban them, the real sin of people in Kansas, is that they passed a law in 2016 that allows Christian school groups on campus to be, wait for it, Christian. That's their whole sin. The state of Kansas now allows Christian organizations on college campuses to recruit and maintain Christian memberships. And for that, California says, no, you don't. And the thing that I love about this is that California is so vigilant in protecting kids from these evil states in the American Union that they ignore other things. Take Josh Ruprecht, for instance, UCLA's athletic department. He said this about going to Kansas to play. He said, quote, "Moving forward, the athletic department will not schedule future games in states that fail to meet the standards established by the new law. UCLA is committed to promoting and protecting equality, diversity, and inclusion." Equality, diversity, and inclusion. This is exactly what UCLA wants to protect by not flying to Kansas. Oh, and in November of 2017, right about the same time that UCLA was playing Georgia Tech in China, of all places, the law banning travel to Kansas was formulated. So let me see if I got this right. Can't spend any state money, can't support as a state, California, anything to do with Kansas, because it lets Christian kids have Christian organizations. But you will fly the basketball team to China, which is tearing down Christian churches, persecuting Christians, has the largest gulag of any country in the world today, kills more of its people, executes more of its people than most of the rest of the world's combined. California, you'll spend your money there, you'll invest your time and send your kids there, your basketball players there, but not to Kansas. Do you need any further realization, America, that we aren't in Kansas anymore in this country?
Have you been having a good time listening to Dr. Duke? Can you not wait to hear what he'll say next? Catch the Dr. Duke Show free online every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube and Facebook Live. Then listen to it again on the podcast version on SoundCloud and iTunes. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review if you like what you heard. And be honest, if you have some qualms, give us some feedback. But right now, it's time for Dr. Duke's Quote of the Day.
Our quote of the day is from the great patriot Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine said, "Persecution is not an original feature of any religion, but it is always the strongly marked feature of all religions established by law." So what he's telling us here, Thomas Paine, is that religions generally don't have built into them a persecutorial methodology. However, when you take any particular religion and make it the state religion, you underwrite it, it has a tendency to become oppressive. And now in the world today, as we see in California, the state religion of California is indeed progressivism. Now that progressivism has been enshrined in law in California, California is using its new religion to prosecute and persecute people from other states. So if you're from Kansas and you allow Christians to hang out with other Christians in organizations on college campuses, California will not allow people from its state to use taxpayer money to visit Kansas. This is exactly what Thomas Paine meant, that when any particular religion, even a secular progressive one, becomes enshrined in law, it immediately turns around and starts oppressing people. We are at the point now where secular progressive worldviews enshrined across the country are now beginning to religiously persecute anybody who disagrees with them. It's time to break the religious intolerance of the American left and take back some sanity. And that does it for us this week. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke, and we'll see you next time.